Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary aviatrix, and I'm excited to be talking to the author of the September 2023 Aviatrix Book Club discussion book, The Great Stewardess Rebellion: How Women Launched a Workplace Revolution at 30,000 Feet.
Reason to stay on ground. Lift your hands and you can touch and fly.
Nell McShane Wulfhart, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you about this book. It was a huge surprise to me how much it really filled in the picture of our history, our collective history of women in aviation. So we'll talk about that some more. But before we get started, can you give us a synopsis of the book for anyone who might not have read it?
Sure. It's called Great Stewardess Rebellion: How Women Launched a Workplace Revolution at 30,000 Feet. And it's essentially a story. It's sort of like half history, half personal stories. It's told through the stories of two stewardesses in particular. I'm going to refer to them as stewardesses because that's what they were called during the time period of the book. I'm fully aware that now we call them flight attendants. One of them is Pat Gibbs, who started working for American Airlines in the early 60s. The other one is Tommy Hutto Blake, who started working for American Airlines in the early 70s. And it's basically the story of how they and their fellow stewardesses like transformed the whole career of being a flight attendant from something that was like a temporary job between college and getting married to something you could actually do into your 60s or sometimes later, and all the sort of trials and tribulations that went along with that on the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest part of this that was just so enlightening was how big a portion of the women's movement this story was. And I'm just gonna gush, like I was gonna say this for later, but oh my gosh, you got Gloria Steinem to blurb your book.
Not only did I get her to blurb my book, I got to meet her in person. Like, I got to go to her apartment in New York and talk with her for like an hour about the book. So Gloria Steinem is in the book because she was a huge
Yeah.
supporter of the stewardesses in the 60s and 70s. Like, she's always been a big, flight attendant supporter. She's always like talking them up and doing whatever she can for them. And so, Gloria Steinem was like a real part of the book. And then I got to go and meet her in person and sort of fangirl quite a lot, which was like
I
top 10
would
life
think
moment for sure.
so wonderful. Congratulations on that. That's so
Thank
I was like,
you.
I literally eked when I saw that. It's like, oh, that must have been the best day of her life.
Oh my God, I was over the moon. It was just such a thrill for me. I'm still not over it.
Well, that's so great. Well deserved for this story too, especially when you understand the full context of everything that was going on. So, what I want to say for me, and I've like written about this, I've posted about it a couple times while I was reading this book, is that what it did for me. We recently had military kind of history, like the Air Force and the women when they revolted so that they could be able to fly in combat. Fighting all very similar issues. But what the author did in that book for me is she bridged this gap between World War II and the time in which women started flying in the military by talking about like what all the enlisted women were doing who were still in the military, and not just enlisted, all the women who were in the military who were not pilots but who were like making small gains toward equal rights for women in the military. That's what you did here for me. You took this huge subject of the flight attendants and their role in the women's movement, and it helped me understand what the pilots were walking into when they were trying to gain, some professional respect in a cockpit in an organization where sexism was institutionalized. Like that really opened my eyes. Um, and you don't even talk about pilots. You don't talk about female pilots. You totally stay with the flight attendants in this book. And I thought that was incredible. Thank you for giving us this history.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I also think the pilot thing is super interesting. And actually, I did a couple interviews with a woman called Bonnie, who was the first woman pilot for American Airlines back in the 70s. And she told these like great stories. I ended up having to cut them because they didn't really tie into the rest of the story. But I just
Yeah.
couldn't get enough of hearing about how she There was like in each airport there are lounges where the flight attendants and the pilots can go to, in between flights. And she told a story about how there was a flight attendants lounge and a pilot's lounge. Obviously, one was all women and one was all men. And on her first day, I think she was in Chicago, she was walking down a hallway, and one of the male pilots had written on the door, like, pilots, like, men only. And then underneath they'd written, and Bonnie. So she could go in and like hang out with them. But yeah, I mean, it was an uphill battle for women trying to be pilots, certainly. And even in like a women dominated profession, like being flight attendants, I mean, that did not mean it was not sexist. Actually, the opposite.
Yeah, egregiously so. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's what a huge part of what I got out of this book, because we come at most of our stories through the lens of pilots. And this year I wanted to honor our cabin crew, both civilian and we're going to be doing some military books next month. Well, now I am very curious about about your story and how it brought you to this book.
I was a travel writer for many years, maybe 15 years. I was freelance, but I wrote for like lots of the New York Times travel section, Travel and Leisure, Condé Nast Traveler, all the sort of travel magazines that are kind of getting fewer and fewer in number right now. Because I was like traveling and living all over the world. So I was always interested in travel. And I had this kind of amazing gig for a few years at the Times travel section where I would interview celebrities about what they took in their carry-on luggage. It was just like, it was really fun. It was just like a little column where it's like, how there was like, there are those articles about like, what's in your handbag? It was basically like that, but for travel. So I could talk to like David Sedaris or RuPaul or whomever.
Fun.
Yeah, one of the people I interviewed had just done a TV show, and one of their episodes had been about sort of myth busting, like the golden age of travel, which I think is, that's what we think of about travel in the 60s, like very, very Mad Men, very Don Draper in first class with a cocktail and filet mignon and, women in designer uniforms. And like, this was all true. Like, he was not myth busting that particular part of it. But then he was telling the story a little bit about how there were these crazy weight restrictions and appearance restrictions, and you pretty much had to be white to be a flight attendant in the 60s, and basically how the flight attendants were not treated as actual workers or industry participants, but really just mascots or like temp workers who were just there for a few years, and then when they got to be 25 years old or married or gained a few pounds, like they would be fired. So I was listening to him talk about this for the column, and I was like, sounds like it would make a really good book. And then I just sort of like scurried off and wrote it. But yeah, it was just sort of that peak of like, I've always been interested in travel and also feminism and also labor. And this book is sort of like the perfect confluence of all those things.
How amazing. That I love to hear sort of inception stories for books. That's crazy. Well, you did a beautiful job of it. Why did you feel like it needed to be told, or what do you hope it accomplishes?
It turned out when I started digging more into the story that the work the flight attendants had done to change their industry had not only implications for every flight attendant, male or female, for up until now, but also that it had these wider implications for women in the workplace. That like all the battles that they fought in the workplace, in the cabin, and also in the courts as they fought to like get more rights, as stuff like for a long time, flight attendants, if they got married, they would be fired. You had to be single to be a flight attendant. And if you had children, you would be fired. And if you managed to avoid both of those things, but you turned 32, or in some airlines, 35, you would be fired. So there were all these things, not even to mention like there were weight charts, and your weight was, your maximum allowed weight was based on your height. And if you gained a few pounds, you could be fired. A long, long list of things like made it a very unstable job. So they were fighting all these battles in the cabin and in the courts, and it turned out that the achievements that they made, this sort of like every step forward they took, had these implications for all American working women, and that a lot of the rights that we enjoy now, I mean, I won't go so far as to say we have equality in the workplace, but like the strides that we have made towards equality in the workplace, many of those can be traced back to the stewardesses. So to me, they're like an essential part of American history, of women's history, And also, as I get into in the second part of the book, of labor history, because there's a point at which the flight attendants break away from male-dominated unions where they were treated basically as mascots, and they form their own independent women-led unions, which is like a huge landmark moment in the labor movement, and for women in labor in general. But it hadn't really been told, so I was thrilled to discover this story and to get to tell it.
Yeah, it's a gem of a story for sure. And so important. And I always talk about also like in this project, of course, this is the women's movement and the civil rights movement. So it's immediately relevant to me either way. But coming at history in general and like entering into these various periods of time and what was going on in the world through the lens of our women in aviation really brings that history to life in new ways. And I don't mean to be naive. I spent 28 years in the military as a female, so I saw plenty. But I continue to be, as we make our way through this canon of stories about women's experiences in aviation, I continue to be surprised when I started learning about what the female pilots went through when they were just starting. I was appalled. I was like, what? That's crazy. And then to dig into this story, I was just like, this stuff was going on in my lifetime. I know I'm old, I'm 50, but like some of this stuff is happening in my lifetime, and I just find that shocking. And I think the thing for me that you did in the book that really drove it all home, that just spoke for volumes for itself, were the ads. Can I talk about some of those ads?
Oh yeah.
Any favorite?
So, okay, so the ads for these are airline ads that were, magazines and newspapers and on television and on the radio throughout the 60s and 70s. And these are also one of my favorite parts of the book. And there's tons of them in the book. And there's tons more I couldn't even include in the book. You can just Google like airline ads 1960s and some amazing stuff will come up. But it was basically this process through which the airlines, they were all targeting the same groups of customers, male business travelers, which I think they're probably still targeting today. Actually, those are probably still they're the group that pays them the most money. But the ads were basically they realized that the way that they could sell the most tickets was not through like safety or range of destinations. Those things were kind of the same for every airline. And they were like, stewardesses, this is what is going to sell tickets. And so they have ads that are all like very sexualized ads, a lot of innuendo. In the 60s, the ads are much more about, come onto the plane, speaking specifically to these like older male business travelers. You'll be taken care of. Your stewardess will bring you a pillow and a cool drink. She'll listen to you talk. She'll practically massage your feet. It's very sort of mothering and caring. Even though the women in the ads are all like, in their very early 20s and very sort of conventionally attractive. And then in the 70s, I think kind of in reaction to the women's liberation movement, the ads get super sexual, and they're practically implying that the women on the plane are there to like, how do I put this?
Service the customers. I mean, it looks to me like the airlines are being pimps and they're whoring out there. I mean, that's what objectively, like if you read these ads, you're like, oh, okay.
It's amazing. I think my favorite is the go fly yourself. I'm sorry,
the fly me.
Fly me. Thank you. Sorry, I'm gonna start that again.
Yeah, no, I got you. Like it's the reaction to it was you go fly yourself.
Right. Yeah,
love.
exactly. So this campaign by National Airlines, they had like photos of real stewardesses, like real young, working stewardesses, and their big face, like right in the center of the ad, and it says like, I'm Cheryl, fly me to Miami. And it gets worse than this, like, I'm Cheryl, like thousands of customers flew me last year, that sort of thing. And so, of course, if you're a working stewardess, like you hated this because not only was it creating this idea in the public of stewardesses as, like floozies or sex workers, basically like flying Playboy bunnies, but it was their employers who were doing this to them. And actually, one of the results of this was, you can see in the background here, my Stewardesses for Women's Rights poster. This was an organization that was started in New York, helped by Gloria Steinem. And this was stewardesses from various airlines getting together and figuring out how they could fight back against the bad working conditions in their job, but also these incredibly sexist ads. Although I will say, to look at them now from the perspective of 2023, like they're I mean, they're really funny. Like they're terrible to imagine, like, living through them, but they are really funny to look at the moment.
Yeah, they're funny, and like I said, I think just so telling about the culture, the institutionalized culture. Um, that's the thing that it just I think I posted the other day. I was like, if you want to understand why the culture of aviation is still so slow in shifting to higher percentages of women in leadership or in the cockpit, then just look at what we walked into just 2-3 generations ago, and having to purge the pipeline of these attitudes over time. It's, we still have people who think women shouldn't be in the cockpit today, like, you know
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
and those
Yeah.
ideas were cemented in the minds of the flying public by these heinous advertisements by the airlines at the time. Yeah, I think my favorite one, it was something like it, the runway strip or something, where they like gave the ladies layers of clothing and would basically, it's a strip tease for the flight, like they're going to take off one garment at a time, and like, they're like teasing the customer with this.
Yeah,
I'm just,
yeah. It was called the Airstrip, and that was Braniff Airways, which is no longer around. But yeah, the stewardesses were given these Emilio Pucci design uniforms, like very high end, fancy uniforms, but lots of
yeah,
layers. And as the flight went on, they would literally start removing the layers, like for for the coffee
yeah,
service or the drink service, whatever. And they wouldn't get naked or anything like that. But like the implication was certainly there that like as the flight went on, they'd be wearing fewer and fewer garments. And they went ahead and called it the Airstrip. Like there was no pretending that it was something other than what it was.
yeah, yeah. Oh, and it's an interesting topic to me. I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts on, I see on the social media that we have some flight attendants who still like to kind of perpetuate and sexualize their role, and they do that for attention. And you know what? More power to all of the ladies, and you're using your sexuality in whatever way that you choose. I just hope that they understand like the full implications and the hard work that these women did to make it so that they don't have to do that in the job. I don't know what your thoughts are
Yeah.
on that.
I mean, I think it's 100%, or it's really like a 180-degree difference between the airlines sort of pimping you out as a sex object and you deciding to present yourself in a way that feels good to you. For me, those are like completely separate things. But of course, I would love every flight attendant to, to look at the history a little more and see, like, back at the points at which they would have been forced to do that kind of thing, and that it wasn't actually a choice yet, because I think that's really important to learn.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. And you have presented it to us in such a way that you can read that in 2 flights. So that's basically what I did. So you could get all that information. Um, the other thought I had was how exciting it is now. I think it was British Airways. I could be misspeaking, but I heard somebody say that one of the airlines had a huge increase in applicants because they are allowing their cabin crews to come as they are. And that's their campaign. Their hiring campaign is come as you are. So now they have all of these uniform options. They're not limiting people with like tattoos and piercings and stuff like that. So that's a huge separate leap. And because they are advertising that as an employer, they are getting more applicants than they need, which is unusual in the airlines right now. So,
I mean, it's so wonderful to see that sort of thing. I also read that Aer Lingus now is not requiring their women flight attendants to wear heels in the airport, which is what they used to require them to do. Like they were allowed to wear flat shoes on the plane, but when they were moving through the airport, they had to wear heels, and they've just gotten rid of that regulation. So there's just to read these sorts of things, especially having like spent so much time immersed in the like long list of things you could and couldn't do, or could and couldn't wear as a flight attendant in the 60s and 70s and 80s. just to be able to see that now, like, yes, there is much more flexibility, much more freedom, much less uniformity, more diversity, more racial diversity, more gender diversity. Like, it's just such a huge contrast to what was going on even 50 years ago. It's a nice reminder that like progress is being made.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Never at the pace
Slowly,
that makes me happy, but yeah,
of course. Yeah,
it's
I
happening.
know.
So let's get into some of the details of the restrictions, and you mentioned a couple of them, by like age restrictions you had to up and out, and then if you got married, but there were these weight restrictions, and probably the worst thing to me is like the fact that you could physically be touched to check your that you're wearing your girdle underneath your uniform. Like that's appalling.
Girdles were a requirement. Yes. No matter what size or shape you were, you had to wear a girdle. So that was a big one. You couldn't wear glasses. You had to have straight teeth. You couldn't have, acne. You had to have very clear skin. No scars. Like they would inspect your hands, that sort of thing. They didn't like a hairy arm on a man or a woman. That was generally considered something that was off limits. And there were a host of other things. And when it came to to the uniform itself, you had to put it on like precisely. There's the American Airlines uniform in the early 60s had a pair of white gloves that was part of the uniform, like sort of Mickey Mouse kind of gloves or California Raisins gloves. And you couldn't, if you were in public, you couldn't take them off. And Pat, one of the sort of heroines of my book, there's a point at which she's on the employee bus, on the American Airlines employee bus. It's in Texas. It's like 100 degrees. She takes off her gloves and somebody writes her up because she like dared to take off her gloves on the employee bus.
Yeah. Another woman, right?
Another woman, yeah, like a flight attendant supervisor.
Yeah. So one of the things that really surprised me and that I thought you did a good job of kind of drawing out is the fact that the EEOC was needed so much push to do anything about regulating what was going on in the airlines. Talk about that. That was shocking to me. So yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was established along with the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and its whole goal was to, work on discrimination in employment. So of course, like the way this was written is like it's supposed to be, for gender, for age, for race, for religion, for like all these different things. But no one, when they formed it, no one had ever really imagined that they would use it for anything other than race. Like it was mostly to help increase racial diversity in employment and fairness in employment. But the stewardesses were the first to see that, this could actually be something we could use to help us. Like, gender was right there, sex was right there in the description. It was part of the mission of the EEOC to help people who are being discriminated against in any kind of employment situation. And they were actually the first people to arrive. Like the EEOC hadn't even opened its doors, and a couple of stewardesses came up the steps, knocked on the door. Like the typewriters were still in the boxes, and they were like, "We're here to lodge a complaint about discrimination against women in the airline industry." So first they helped them unpack the typewriters and set up the desks, and then they lodged their complaints. And everyone was a little startled, and it took like a long time. Stewardesses lodged complaint after complaint, like from all different airlines, that they were being discriminated against. Like they were, being fired when they got married. They were being fired when they got pregnant. They were being fired when they turned 32. They were being fired if they gained a few pounds. Like all these different reasons. And the EEOC wrote down all these complaints, but it took a very long time for them to take action on them. Like they were really more focused on race, and like God knows that needed to happen too. But it was really the stewardess like exerting constant pressure on the EEOC to tackle some of these complaints that got us some of the workplace equality laws that we have right now.
Yeah, yeah. And then the thing that you talked about sort of the revolution within the labor movement. Talk a little bit more about that and their impact there.
Sure. So flight attendants, for the most part, have always been unionized. The one major domestic exception is Delta Airlines, which is currently going through like a union vote of its own, which is a really big deal. But almost every other major American airline, the stewardesses have been unionized like for decades and decades. And most of these stewardesses belong to like one of the big labor federations, most of them at the Transport Workers Union. Now, in the 60s and 70s, the Transport Workers Union, it was a lot of, subway drivers, bus drivers, a lot of kind of what people sometimes picture, like an outdated idea of what like a union a member is, like an old white dude. Those are most of the people who are running the Transport Workers Union. And their goals did not align for the most part with the stewardesses' goals. The stewardesses were super concerned about, they wanted obviously better wages, but they wanted long-term employment. They wanted single rooms on layovers, which is something that every pilot got, but the stewardesses had to share. They wanted fewer restrictions on their appearance. And the leaders of the Transport Workers Union, who helped negotiate the contract for the stewardesses at all these airlines, they were not interested in negotiating for these things. This was not even like something that occurred to them. And they didn't really believe that the stewardesses were workers in the way that like, a bus driver was a worker. They were like, right. These girls come in for a few years and they go off and they get married. And like, what are they even doing here? They don't have to support a family, that kind of thing. So this goes on for years and years. The stewardesses are pushing the Transport Workers Union to fight for the things that they actually want in their contracts. Transport Workers Union is like not making a whole lot of progress on these. And eventually there's a moment comes when Pat Gibbs, one of the women who is like one of the stars of my book, she basically launches a rebellion against the Transport Workers Union. And she and a group of other stewardesses start campaigning to take all the American Airlines stewardesses out of the Transport Workers Union and into their own independent union led by women. This is kind of at the climax of the book. And spoiler, it is successful. And the American Airlines stewardesses, along with many other stewardesses at many other airlines, they vote to leave the Transport Workers Union and they go off and they form their own unions. And so now they are the ones negotiating with the airlines. They are the ones at the bargaining table and actually are getting the things that they want in their contract. So this is, I think, such an interesting story, a labor story, especially at the moment when we're looking at auto workers on strike, WGA strike, actors strike, Starbucks strike, Amazon. Like we're at such an interesting moment for the labor movement right now. And I just love looking back at like what they were doing in the 1970s as like, actually, we don't have to play by these rules anymore. We can make a job the way that we want to work it. We can actually like achieve working conditions that make it an appealing job or really a career rather than a temporary job. So I find it really inspiring.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. It's a very happy victory that we learned about. So how has writing this book affected your life?
Well, I would love to say that it became a bestseller and it changed my life and now I'm rolling in money and very famous. I would say that it was writing a book itself is a really interesting experience. I bet some people really hate doing it. Like they sign a contract to write a book and then they are like, this is a nightmare. I have to make myself get up and go to work every day and write this thing. And my deadline is 1 year away. So there's like not a lot of accountability. But for me, it was really a pleasure. Like I got to spend so much time doing interviews with flight attendants. Not just Pat and Tommy, but many, many other flight attendants and other people who were sort of included in the story. And that for me was the most interesting part, is to hear these stories like from the horse's mouth. And just to be able to incorporate them all with all the history and the research that went on into something that actually turned into like a story with like a full narrative arc. And now the book is out and it's in paperback at the moment. And it's been a really interesting process, just like learning about how, Big Five publishing works and how that process goes on.
Yeah. And who published it for you?
Doubleday.
Okay. Well, we'll talk more in depth. I have more questions about the whole publication path for you. But do you have any other books in the works that you want to tell us about? Or ideas?
No, it took me like 10 years to find this idea. So it might take me a while to find another idea. It turns out like all the people that I'm interested in writing about are sort of women who are either dead or at least 80 years old, like women doing very unusual things or things that were sort of ahead of their time. So there's a couple ideas that I'm pursuing, but I haven't turned any of them into a book proposal yet. I'm still just kind of enjoying the research stage.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about this book before we move on to talking about writing?
I don't think so. I just think that it's an untold story, which I think is something that people are often interested in, but it's an important one. And yeah.
It was so well done. Now, you really, like I said, I think for the context of our history collectively in aviation, to understand why we have initiatives like the International Air Transport Association's 25 by 2025 initiative, which is to promote women to non-traditional roles and positions of leadership to 25% by the year 2025. You've got like 100 and probably 30 to 40 signatories to that initiative who I sit in on. I kind of am like a little uh, mole in their group because I just listen to their updates on like what their companies are doing. Like the last meeting, I listened to Air Canada talk about their diversity initiatives, which is amazing. And so it all, to understand the full picture of where we started and how we got here, you really need this history in in your knowledge bank to really understand what the culture's up against. And so thank you for telling this story, and I'm so excited that we got to add it to our reading list this year.
Thank you. And honestly, I think maybe the one thing that I would say about it is that I think on the surface it can sound quite dry to be like, oh, right, labor, feminism, flight attendants, industry, but that actually it is like such a fun and interesting period. And there is so much drama and there are fights and there are love affairs and there's like a lot of human interest, I think, that carries the story through. Just, it's not dry. I just want to put that out
Oh
there.
no, absolutely not. I'm sorry if I didn't say that enough, but absolutely, because and it's it's always nice to have like a couple of people on whom to anchor the story so that you can really, and you did that super very well. So yeah, no, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, Nell, thank you so much for this. We'll move on to writing. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this interview, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Join us in the Aviatrix Book Club in October when we continue to honor our cabin crews, this time with our military women with a book pairing. The Hurricane Within by former U.S. Coast Guard flight mechanic Ashley Leppert and Chinook Crew Chick by former Royal Air Force crew member Liz McConaughey. Check out the Literary Aviatrix website where you can sign up for my monthly newsletter, find all of my interviews, and over 600 books that feature women in aviation. As always, a huge thanks to Shaster Ways and Michael Wilds of the Women's Soar Group for their help producing this interview and supporting all things literary aviatrix. Blue skies and happy reading.
I'm ready to go again. I'm ready to say